Okay, so here is your video for today. We're going to talk about chapter 2 for Jekyll and Hyde. It is Search for Mr. Hyde. Okay, um, in this chapter, we're going to recall what happened last chapter. And yes, that is what Mr. Hyde looks like. Again, he's very deformed looking. And remember, we learned in last chapter he had trampled the young girl in front of that mysterious door we were talking about in the London homes. And we have two characters that we know about. We have Mr. Utterson and we have Mr. Enfield. And they are two guys that they go on these walks together, and they're probably cousins, if we had to guess. And Mr. Enfield is telling Mr. Utterson about the trampling of the girl. So in chapter 2, Mr. Utterson is to write a will for Jekyll. And Jekyll asked Mr. Utterson, if anything happens to me, all my possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde. Now, that's interesting that he would be friends with a man that looks like this, right? And who was caught trampling a young girl many, many years ago. Here's Dr. Jekyll. He is a scientist with many, many titles. He's a doctor of medicine as well as a doctor of law, which would kind of explain the relationship he has with Dr. Utterson. We do see, though, that they have had a falling out. So there's some foreshadowing if you're on page 10 here. Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though of course I continued to take an interest in him for an old sake as they say, I have seen a devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash. So something happened between Jekyll and Utterson where they no longer get along, and this is what we call foreshadowing, something to foreshadow the reader to happen later in this is a novella. So there's suspense that's been created to happen later in the novel. We don't know what yet, but they had a falling out. And we don't know why, but something happened. And he asks, did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde? So Hyde and Jekyll, they get along very well, so well that he leaves all of his belongings, all of his possessions, and his estate to him. However, he's just described as pure evil. So if you look on the bottom of page 11, the face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. So how terrible to be described that way. Once Jekyll and Utterson actually talk, not Jekyll, I'm sorry, Hyde. So at the top of page 13, he asked to see his face. Because again, he looks very deformed. And he knows this because here's the dramatic irony here. The reader knows that Enfield told Utterson he looked deformed looking. He was like very ugly, an extraordinary looking man. And he says, well, how did you know me? And he says, by description. And he's like, well, whose description? Who told you about me? He's like, oh, we just have some friends in common. He's like, no, we don't. He's like, who do we have in common? And he says, oh, Jekyll. And all of a sudden he kind of gets flushed with anger and he's like, you are a liar. Jekyll and I and we're not friends. We don't have that friend in common. So you can see this is kind of interesting. Why would he react that way? So I just want you to think about that. And I want you to get these notes down. I'm going to attach this slideshow, and we'll talk more about this on Monday. Goodbye. Maybe if I can figure out how to stop this. Stop.